And we're in that segment of the show where we bring in Fred Brown, our epidemiologist, our man about town, bon vivant, infectious disease expert.
And well-known street fighter. That's
yes,
right.
that too, yes. So, and Fred always has something interesting to tell us, not always good news, but certainly interesting news, something that we don't typically hear from other sources out there. So let's talk about one of the things you wanted to cover last week and we didn't have time was you said there was an epidemiologist report. Why don't you go into detail on that?
Yeah, I have some of the graphs. I'd be happy to show them to you. Basically, the New York Times is interested. What was done was the University of Michigan did a big survey, and they asked everybody, how long do you think it'll take until you're ready to resume normal activities safely? And this was a survey of 21 countries, 20,000 people around the world, Muslim countries, Christian countries, democratic countries, socialist countries, communist countries, open market, closed market, island states, in the middle of Europe. And what do you think the average respondent said?
Hard to say.
18 months would be my guess. 12 to 18 months.
So Canada was one of the 4 countries that came in at 18 months. That was the longest wait that anyone had. But on average, everyone said within 6 months, I think it's going to be safe out there.
Right.
Boy, that's optimistic.
Yeah. And so and what's interesting is that actually was kind of in 3 groups. About 25% of the group said it's probably going to take a long time. It's probably going to take more than 3 months and possibly never again. About 25% of the people said, I'm ready to do it today. About 25, and they were talking about probably about 30 different activities, maybe 50 different activities. About 25% of the people said, 1 to 3 weeks, within a month. And then the rest of them said, 25% said 1 to 3 months. So you had today immediately, 25%, 25% saying in about a month, 25% saying 1 to 3 months, and 25% saying, gosh, it's going to be longer than 6. So here's what the epidemiologist said. I thought it'd be interesting to say the epidemiologists were asked the same sort of questions. And now I was one of them that was a request. And there were some interesting comments. The first comment was they were disappointed in the timeframes. They said, what do you mean a month? The virus doesn't think in terms of months. It thinks in terms of, do we have a vaccine for this thing or not? Do we have a effective therapeutic or not? I'd rather answer the questions with regard to what the key milestone is rather than our artificial sense of time, which, as Einstein pointed out, was all relative anyway. So here's what the epidemiologist said. How long will it be before I'm willing to go back to go and look at sporting events, concert, and plays? And you can see that
1 year plus.
The result was pretty negative. They don't expect to go back to do much of any sporting events, concerts, and plays, which they consider, us epidemiologists are cautious types, and we consider a lot of these things as being, super nice, but not necessary for life. So 64% said, nah, doubtful. What's interesting is that over the summer, only 3% were with the rest of the participants, right? So the non-epidemiologists, 100% of them would say by fall. I'm sorry, 75% of them would say by fall, I'm ready to go. In this case, less than 3% was a comparative epidemiologist. So let's take a look at another one: hugs and handshakes. One of the comments was, real epidemiologists don't shake hands. Ever. And you can see, about half of them are saying probably not again. So sorry, no more shaking of hands to close the deal. Yeah. But on the other hand, half of them are saying, "Oh, by next spring, I may be ready to think about shaking hands without, having myself embodied in armor, work and wearing gloves." Let's take a look at the next piece. Airplane.
Well, one of the good things I will say, one of the good things this has done is pretty much eliminated the awkward hug.
That's right.
That's not a bad thing, really, because you don't know whether some people are really huggers and other people's aren't, and that's, you don't know what to do. So,
well, I'm from Switzerland, and in the French part of Switzerland, we actually kiss people on the cheek 4 times. That's
yep.
Greeting with friends. That has stopped. I can assure you.
The Dutch only do 3. I was visiting friends in Amsterdam, and I did the kiss kiss, and they go, no, one more. And I go,
That's right.
"Oh, sorry, yeah,
They thought you were mad at them. Okay,
yeah, I
gotcha.
guess, you know,
That's the Parisian, sort of brush off business kiss. That's a double kiss.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the Russians are right on the lips.
What can we say about Parisians, right? They're always brushing people off. So.
That's right. So here's the airplane survey. Kind of 40% said it's going to be over a year, and that was basically over a year meant maybe never. So that was sort of the time frame offered. So 40% are saying we're not going to go on airplanes for a long time, and if we do, it's going to be with a lot of protective gear and probably some guarantees by the airline about how safe they keep their planes and how socially distanced they're able to maintain themselves. So that was the comments coming back on airplanes. This was done in June, and since then, of course, things have gotten worse. So presumably, epidemiologists will even be less. Oh, I went backwards. Apologies. Here's stopping wearing masks. Everyone's wondering how long will it be before I stop wearing masks? And about 98% of the general public says, by fall, we're going to be done with this thing. Everything's wonderful.
Nope.
Certainly by Christmas. I'm moving insane if we're wearing Christmas. But you can see the epidemiologists are saying more than a year, absolutely. Only the Canadians came through saying 18 months. So that was that. Then we got on visiting the elderly, and this is the toughest one. I've got a mom who's going to turn 90 this year, and I see her outside, but I won't go inside. And my wife is the same way, outside but not inside. And you can see the epidemiologists generally are, it's a year plus before they're willing to see the elderly generally and their family members, about 40% rate. So there's been a big question that's coming up on social media. And a friend of mine is running, he went to high school with me, is running for congressional seat. And he was saying that there's evidence that suggests that actually these masks are causing CO2 to build up, carbon dioxide to build up and not getting through. So I wanted to, and it's sort of going through the community as this is why masks are dangerous, because there's a CO2 buildup and you can actually cause asphyxiation due to CO2 buildup. So I wanted to give you a sense of the size of a CO2 molecule versus the size of an average pore in a CO2 mask. And out of an N95 mask, which are you can get N98 masks, but these are about our most effective healthcare level masks. So here's the little dot on the left is your CO2, and that's 116 by 232 picometers in size. That's the little dot way over there on the left.
Okay.
And then the question is, does the hole that's in the middle of the slide prevent that from getting through? And you can see that that's 0.3 microns, and 5% of you can get a sense of the scale here. These are not molecular sieves that we're talking about when we're talking about putting on a mask. Generally, though, what people are saying is sometimes it's hard for me to breathe in a mask. And when that happens, the reason it's hard for you to breathe through the mask is because you're exerting yourself too much. The right answer to prevent spread of infection is not to remove the mask or to give yourself more air. It's to slow yourself down. And that's why in public places where you see the least amount of mask wearing is actually in gyms. Only about 41% of people who are in gyms are actually wearing masks because they just can't exert themselves that much and still get enough of it.
I noticed they didn't ask the epidemiologists about the gym. I think that would have been a whole bunch of nevers, I would bet, till there's a vaccine anyway.
Yeah.
So how big is the average? My question would be, okay, so the hole in the mask is 0.3 microns.
Yeah.
How big is the average water droplet that might be carrying the virus that's coming out of my mouth right now?
Actually, it's a collection of, so it's the total size of the water droplet is, if they're droplets, so they're true droplets, are about 0.4 of a micron. So the droplet.
Okay, so this is just barely big enough to stop them then. That's probably what it's designed to do.
That's right. That's right. If it's a true droplet, now the size of the particles themselves without any moisture, which makes them unviable, they have to have some moisture to survive, is slightly smaller than that. But yeah, 0.4 in dry heat, and that's the size of a droplet. Aerosols get slightly smaller than that. So the aerosols can get through sometimes if it's not humid outside.
Okay.
So that's sort of the rule. So I thought that was sort of interesting about the difference between, you know, epidemiologists and what they're seeing with the data, and the general public and what they're seeing with the data. And it's too bad, because the epidemiologists do have a lot more data, and we're working with a lot more data every day than the average person sees. I wanted to show you one more quick thing, if you like, and that is there's sort of a debate going on right now about the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act was what the House of Representatives passed, and it has slightly over $3 billion,
Trillion.
trillion with a T, $1 trillion available to continue funding the economy and to do certain things. And the Republicans have said, well, we think it's probably closer to about $1 trillion, $1 trillion, and so there's going to be some compromises made. But one of the stakes in the ground that President Trump has put forth is he doesn't really want to spend $25 billion with a B on testing. He thinks that's superfluous. And actually, in this particular case, I'd like to present the case that it probably is a good idea to invest a little bit more in testing and tracing. And I don't know if can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So basically, the economics are pretty easy here. If you don't test and trace, that means you are, let me put this onto slideshow so you can see it better. If you don't test and trace, then you're really dependent on a therapeutic or a vaccine. Now, there have been a couple of very good new pieces of news about vaccines, which we'll get into it, you know, after this discussion, that are coming in from both AstraZeneca and from Pfizer. And the good news is that we're seeing titer levels that are high enough to stop especially neutralizing titer levels in a vaccine that are high enough to stop the virus, we think, but only after a booster shot. Really, we need to have, you know, two shots about a month apart. And now finally we're saying that there's some T cell activity, excuse me, which allows us to have a longer course of immunization. The issue with the antibodies was that now people were seeing that the antibodies were actually getting reduced by about a factor of 10 over about a 3-month period, normal antibodies. And so they were worried that the antibodies would disappear and there would be no memory about COVID. And when the next virus hit you, you get infected again. Luckily, T cells seem to be involved, which is very important. And they've just announced that today. So that's helpful. But we don't know whether this thing is safe for everybody. We don't know what the dosing levels yet are yet. We don't know who's going to win the war, whether it be China or the United States. There are a whole bunch of questions. So what we have today to work with really is testing and tracing. That's what our ability to control this virus depends on. Identifying the virus where it is and stopping the outbreaks early by separating and washing hands and wearing a mask. So that's all we have. And so if you look at testing and tracing, if we don't invest at least 25 billion, my worry is that we're not going to be able to control the virus in the short term. And my biggest worry is what happens in November and December. Right now, the virus is sort of playing with us, frankly. You know, it's spiking here and there. But come November, December, when everyone goes back at home, we could have a real problem. We could have hundreds of thousands of people dying.
Then you combine that with the normal flu season. You'll have the normal flu and then the COVID flu, or whatever you want to call it, combined together. I mean, that sounds like a pretty interesting cocktail there, right?
It's really worrisome. And so I worry very much about the investment in our test and trace capabilities before November comes along. So here's my pitch to President Trump, and hopefully it's convincing to you guys. The first part of the pitch is COVID is sort of special. The way COVID and other coronaviruses move is they move asymptomatically. So you can see on this chart, 44% of the time, you get a symptomatic or environmental transmission. In the case of traditional kinds of outbreaks like we've had in the past, like polio or TB or typhus, it's slightly less than 10% is asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission. What that means is that all you have to do is test people who are feeling sick, and you're going to get most of them under most disease states. The problem we've got with COVID is you can test everybody who's feeling sick and still miss over half of your population you want to test. So if you're not testing randomly, in addition to people who are sick, then you're going to miss half of the infections, over half of the infections. And when you miss over half the infections with a transmission rate of 2.5, you go in logarithmic growth really fast once you get community spread starting, and we already have community spread in this.
Let me ask you a question, Fred. What are if you know, because for instance, I have allergies, and in March I had a really bad allergy attack, and I didn't think much of it at the time because it's something that happens every year. Other people, I'm sure, out there have the same sort of things, and then of course there's the regular flu. What differentiates COVID from, say, an allergy attack or from the normal flu? What are there different symptoms?
Oh, yeah, hugely. The biggest issue we've got is that COVID is not just a respiratory disease. We originally thought it was just a respiratory disease. It turns out that in about 10% of the cases, after about 8 to 10 days, this moves into your bloodstream. And when it moves into your bloodstream, the response of the body, the response is thrombosis, which means you've got huge number of clots all through your body and it kills you. So it's a very different kind of disease. And the other problem is that asthma is a come and go. I mean, it's there chronically, but it comes and it goes. Once you're over the disease, you can have permanent damage of your lungs, but over 50% of people who've had COVID are currently being treated for CNS disorder or central nervous system disorder, believe it or not. And we're seeing these symptoms continue past what we call resolution of the quote unquote disease in diabetics and hypertension and scarred lungs, in delusions in the central nervous system. So it's a very tricky disease. COVID is a much more tricky disease than asthma. Asthma kills a lot of, especially youth, when it's uncontrolled. But it's not nearly as deadly in its chronic stages as COVID is.
Now, the other thing that I've been hearing, and I don't know if it's true, is some people can also get some sort of brain damage from COVID. Is that right?
That's right. So we've got two different kinds of, I'm sorry, in the Midwest right now, we've got 3 different COVID strains. The original COVID strain actually affected both your nasal passages and your lungs at about the same rate. It was much less, it's about 4.5 times less infectious as the new European strains that have come in. And these new European strains actually are much more transmissible because they stay in your nose more than they stay in your lungs. If you think about it, it's harder to transmit the disease out of your lungs. You've got to really cough than if you're coming through your nose, which is closer to the surface, and transmission is easier. In addition, these new COVID molecules have 4.5 times more spikes, more different reactive surfaces on them that'll attack the ACE2 receptor site, which then infects you. And so that's why this new virus is so much more infectious, but it's also more deadly, and it has more symptoms. It's not necessarily more deadly. We're not sure exactly if it's more deadly, but it has more symptoms of the brain because it attacks your ophthalmic, the nasal bud, and it stays there. And it's because it's attacking that area more than your lungs. You actually have a much higher incidence of the virus entering your central nervous system through your nose, through your nasal passageways, and a sense of smell into your brain, which is very close, obviously, to your brain.
And I've also heard there are even some dermatological effects. This phenomenon I've heard of, COVID toes and sores on your hands and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's part of the. So the biggest thing that makes COVID different is this loss of sense of taste and loss of sense of smell. And we're using new detection systems that actually they're sort of interesting. In the past, right now what we're doing is we're measuring everyone's temperature when they enter a building, and you can count it with temperature sensor, and that is not. It's very sensitive because once you get over a certain temperature range, it goes off saying the person has a fever. The problem is it's not very specific. You can have a fever because of almost any disease type that you have a response to. The other thing is that it varies by your skin tone. So if you have a darker skin tone, you'll be measured at a higher level of temperature, which means you have to, the adjustments are kind of tricky. So you get a lot more false positives with this screening stage. We now have ways of looking at people's sense of smell. So you'll take a scratch and sniff, you'll smell it, and you'll ask what the smell is. And if you're correct, chances are, with about 80% kind of sensitivity here, 88% actually, then you don't have a COVID problem. But if you're one of the, if you do say, yes, I smell X, but it's really smell Y, then you're going to be screened out. You're going to say, oh, you could have COVID, go get a test. We're also looking at people's voices, because people's voices change, their larynx changes, their musculature change with COVID. Because and so MIT currently is looking at speaking and being able to hear on your telephone. If you think about it, you can use your hand phone and say, blah, 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 speak into a common sentence, and they can tell whether your voice is slightly elevated or lower in pitch, and by the pitch and the intonations of the words that you're saying, they can actually detect COVID pretty accurately actually today.
Wow.
So sort of interesting stuff starting to come out in the diagnostics, so that we're starting to get interesting diagnostics. The other thing about COVID, in addition to the transmission, is, and so here's what we're doing with viral testing, and here's what President Trump was arguing about. And he's saying, look, it costs a lot to do these tests, and we're getting some false positives. The issue is that if you look at how many we're diagnosing about 80,000 people a day. The problem is we have a positive rate of about 8.3%, which means we actually probably have about twice as many of the people, at about 3 to 5% is what you'd expect to see in the population given the transmission. And in fact, we're at 8.2, so it means we're about twice as many are probably going around undiagnosed as diagnosed. So that means we've got 160,000 new cases a day that we can't, and we're only diagnosing half of them. The other problem is that it's taking us 5 days on average to turn around the test. If you go in for a test, you get your results back in 5 days. So you're walking around for 5 days potentially infecting people, not knowing it. If you're feeling sick, of course, you're going to stay in, but that's unacceptable. And in some places where we really need it most, like in Arizona and in Florida, these test turnaround times are getting to be 22 days long. By 22 days long, the average person dies in 24 days. So, if you're going to die, if you're on a death track, it's kind of 24 to 27 days. So, you're that's just way out of line. The other problem is, of course, we're repeating tests on a lot of people. So a lot of states are reporting their overall tests, but they're not saying, oh, by the way, Joe had 5 tests, right? Because he had the disease. He wanted to find out whether he's getting better. He had to do it for therapeutic purposes. All of a sudden, you're testing one person several times. So when they say we're doing right now our capacity right now is about 750,000 tests a day in the whole United States. I gave them 800,000. So I say if you can actually do 800,000 tests a day, then we actually need to do about 26.4 million if we want to get the turnaround time down to 1 and to be able to detect 160,000 people. And that costs that's going to cost you about $4.5 billion. If you are now, Quest and LabCorp, of course, charge you a lot more, but they're real costs. If you're the lab manager, for the reagent, for the tech, for the equipment, once it's bought, is about $5 a test. So that means we need about $5 billion for that level of testing to occur.
Well, it's a drop in the bucket when you're talking about a $3 trillion relief plan, or even a $1 trillion relief plan, right? So.
Yes. So that's why I'm hoping that President Trump says, okay, I'm good with $5 billion. But here's the other problem. The other problem with the whole thing is that not only are we having a lot of asymptomatic tests, but it spreads clumpily. It doesn't spread nice and smooth, right? It spreads so that one guy infects 75 people and the next 20 guys don't infect anybody. The problem, so if you miss that one guy who's infecting the 75 people, even if you test the other 24 and they all come up, positive, and you contact trace all those people, they haven't infected anybody. It's that one guy you got to find. And so if you're not really covered really closely with the contact tracing afterwards, you're going to miss a lot of your big vectors. Here's the typical spread. This is what Spanish flu does, is about 40% of the infected. So every 4 people are going to infect 4 more people and so on. Here it's 1 in 10 for our COVID spread. Here it's 4 in 10. All of a sudden you can detect that pretty easily with a pretty loose connection of contact tracing. Here, for COVID, you need a really tight contact trace capability. And today, about 1/3 of the people who are actually finally reached by the contact tracers will refuse to answer any questions because they don't, they don't want to be bugged, and they feel it's an infringement on their privacy. And so we're already way below the level we need to in contact trace to be in the contact tracing area.
Well, there was a news story today about a couple someplace out west who was tested positive, and they were refusing to agree to stay home. So they actually had to have a police guard outside their house.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
It's a lack of responsibility toward others, I guess. It's somewhat ingrained in the American psyche as the rugged individualist, and it's really biting us this time.
It is. Well, part of it is, of course, if you're someone who's out there and you're feeling pretty good, and you haven't been tested, right? Because we're only testing people who are feeling bad right now. We're rationing our tests. And you're feeling pretty good. You say, gosh, I still have to wear a mask. I still have to socially distance. I'm probably not even infected, So it's sort of a big burden. If we were able to test more, people would be pretty sure about what their health status was, and then they could act appropriately. Right now, we're sort of saying, well, trust us, even though you're feeling pretty good, there's a good chance you got the disease. That people are saying, come on, it's hot, it's uncomfortable. So we have to get testing more. Now, I just want to show you one last slide, and that's how long it takes. You wouldn't believe how intensive contact tracing is. It turns out that it takes 15 person days in order to track one new case in the United States today. So it takes a team of 15 people one day to contact trace everybody. The truth is, it's actually, our teams are teams of 5, so it's taking us about 3 days to contact trace after you get the positive diagnosis and you report it. So you're already kind of 5-6 days into it when you start the contact tracing, and then you got to go 2 generations back, right? Who did you contact, and then who did they contact? That's a lot of people, potentially, between 20 and 50 on average, and we're only able to get between 6 to 10 responses generally with our 15 days per case. In China, they're able to turn around. They're able to do it about 3 times better than we are, and that's mostly because their people are more compliant. I think, and so they can get they can get tracing pretty good. So if you do the math, and we're doing, we have about 170,000 new cases a day. Say some are known, some are unknown. It's going to cost us about, I calculated about $40 billion a year if we're as good as China at contact tracing. It'll cost us about 3 times that, or $120 billion a year to contact trace if it still takes 15 days per case. And then people have to be able to say, yes, I'm willing to respond. So here's what happens when you combine the 2 things together. This is done by University of Oxford, and it says, percent of success in isolating cases. That's what your success rate is after you as an individual has tested positive. So you had your diagnostic test. So the bottom is your diagnostic test. That's the x-axis. And the y-axis is the percent success in quarantining contacts. That means you've done the contact tracing, and you're able to quarantine everybody who that person who's been diagnosed positive is within 3 day, 2 day, 1 day, an instant. So if it takes us 3 days, and right now it's taking us 5, but if it takes us 3 days, you can see that it's almost impossible to control the virus. No matter how good your tests are, you can be 100% effective in your diagnostic, 100% of the case of the contact tracing, and you're still just able to control it. As you get to 2 day turnarounds, there's a chance you can control it. What you really need to have is an instant test, and that's why people are talking about point of care testing. You don't want to have to send your test out to some central lab and wait for 3 days to get it back and then read it and then say, oh my gosh, I got the disease. I just infected half my family. You want to be able to say, you go to the doctor and you say right away, 5 seconds later, 5 minutes later, you're positive, go home and isolate. If we can get to that point, even better would be a home test. And there are a number of home tests that are being developed right now that go out on your phone. So your mobile phone, you have a home test. Every morning you get up, you do the test, and it either says yes or no, and you know right then and there, I'm infected or not infected every morning. If you can do that, then then with contact tracing, even if you're only at 30% rate of contact tracing, you can control this. And it costs about $150 billion a year.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it at that, Fred. We've blown through the half an hour. I know it
Oh
goes
my
by very
gosh.
quickly.
It always happens that way.
Oh, it goes so fast. So in other words, right now, if you don't want to have to put all your eggs in the vaccine or therapeutics basket, you spend a little bit of money on the testing in the short term, and I think we can get ourselves past November, December this year. That's the good news.
Traditional four-year students love Lawrence Technological University's thriving campus life, but LTU has always met non-traditional students' needs too. Lawrence Tech offers over 100 degree and certificate programs that can get adult students started or back on track. And most of our classes are conveniently offered evenings at our beautiful Southfield campus or online, so you can balance your social, family, and work life even while you power up your career. Lawrence Tech, where Blue Devils dare.